Good evening and welcome to the American Family Association's weekly cable program. The AFA is a national organization devoted to strengthening the American family, the very foundation of our civilization. Tonight's topic is a look at the Obama administration on fiscal policy, social policy, and foreign policy. And our host is Patty Knapp.
Good evening. Tonight's guests are George Marlin and Frank Russo. George is a noted author who often writes for the New York Post, Newsday, and the New York Times. He has served as CEO of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, ran for mayor of New York City, and he's currently president of a financial group. Welcome, George. Frank Russo is a former division manager with AT&T and Verizon and serves on the executive committee of Long Islanders for Educational Reform and the Nassau County Conservative Party. Frank is married with 7 children and 27 grandchildren. Welcome, Frank. And my co-host is Connell Friel. Connell?
Thanks, Patty. George, let's begin with you. Let's begin with the financial crisis facing the President-elect Obama. What do you think are the underlying causes of the financial crisis in the country and New York State?
Well, there's a host of things, but if we want to zero in on the credit crunch we have at this point in time, in September of 1999, the New York Times had a very interesting article and said that the White House and the Congress was putting pressure on the banks to drop their standards for giving loans. And the Times said, this is interesting, since most of those loans are generally packaged and purchased by Freddie Mae, Fannie Mac. They said, this seems it could work in good times. But what happens if the market declines? Freddie and Fannie get into a lot of trouble. Well, for a change, the New York Times prophetic. That's exactly what happened. Simply put, banks lowered their standards for lending. There is a mentality that everyone's entitled to have a mortgage and everyone's entitled to own a home. The banks, of course, are happy to give mortgages low standards because they package and sell the loans and get a servicing fee, so they don't have the huge risk. Those loans are then taken by investment bankers who have to figure out what are we going to do with this. So they put together these packages of loans, price them on models, and in the good times it really didn't matter. And to add to the problem, banks who got these loans off their books decided to buy them for their investment portfolios, figuring, oh, look at this extra yield I'm picking up. I'll impress my shareholders that I have all this more yield on my books and my capital investment, my investment portfolio. Well, when things blow up and they began to realize that these were priced by models and not by market-to-market values, no one understood what they were worth. They were very illiquid, and under accounting rules, you had to write this down to zero, and that began the snowball effect, whereas Bear Stearns was stuck with a lot of these, guaranteed a lot of them through various insurance policies. There's a whole long paper trail for this, but at the end of the day, Bear Stearns was not bailed out, it was taken out. Lehman Brothers was taken out. The shareholders were basically written out. Citicorp, we saw some of the banks that got into serious trouble. So it was this whole sort of domino effect that affected the entire system. And we wound up now in the state of New York, for instance, which relied on 20% of its state revenue from Wall Street financial services. With the insurance companies cutting back, 70,000 investment bankers in the city of New York being fired this year, we're seeing the revenue dropping considerably in the state of New York, where they're now projecting over the next 4 years north of a $40 billion deficit. Wow. In 1980, New York State's revenue was 3% from financial services. A year ago, it was 20%. So it's affecting the entire nation, and it's just a snowball effect. And because of the credit crunch, other companies are getting into trouble because they don't have liquidity. They can't refinance their loans. So it just goes on and on and on and on. And that's why the federal government had to step in a big way, because they feared the whole financial system could collapse. That's in a nutshell anyway.
Frank, same question. What's the underlying cause?
Yeah, I view this as having 4 major components. It started with, the credit crisis started with the housing crisis, the mortgage crisis. And as George said, banks were making, for many years now, loans to people that never should have received the loans. Now, whether or not these people were deceptively led into these loans, or whether the banks were being deceptive, and whether the banks were just being foolish and stupid, I think it's both in different cases. But they were being encouraged by politicians. And what's ironic is that during the recent presidential campaign, I think, in all fairness, I think the Republican administration, since they were in control, they were the president and controlled the Senate for a good part of the time and the Congress for part of the time, they took most of the blame, the Republicans. But in reality, the bulk of the politicians who were encouraging Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and the banks to make these idiotic loans to people who could not afford them were Democrats, including New York State Senator Chuck Schumer, smart guy. But Chuck Schumer was one of the main culprits in my mind. Senator Christopher Dodd from Connecticut, who headed the Banking Commission, another culprit. Barney Frank on the congressional side. Maxine Waters was a classic one. I've seen videotapes of Maxine Waters, this radical leftist from California. All, in effect, what they were doing, the pressure was, the message was, the subtle message was to the banks, if you don't make these loans to these low-income people who are primarily minorities, you're discriminating on the basis of race. That was the implication. The message was being conveyed to the banks and to Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, that if you don't make these crazy loans, these idiotic loans to people who couldn't afford them, there's a subtle form of racism involved here. That was the implication. And it was not all Democrats, some Republicans too, but overwhelmingly it was the Democrat, the left-wing Democrats, including Chuck Schumer of New York State, who in my mind played a key role in bringing on the credit crisis. Now, besides making these stupid loans to people who couldn't afford them, they didn't, no income checks,
Loan-to-value ratios were changed.
Right, crazy. Loans that any sane person would not make. Now, that's the first factor. The second factor is the credit rating agencies, Moody's, S&P's, Fitch's. I fault them, and I think they are going to be sued. I'm sure in fact, from what I gather, they are being sued. And I'd like to see the repercussions go back. I don't think people who retired or left those companies beforehand should get out of this. I think they're all, in my view, civilly liable for giving these loans, these idiotic collateralized debt obligations, as they call them, these securitized loans where they bundle these loans together, knowing full well that many of them were made to people who couldn't afford them, and rating them AAA, misleading, deceptively misleading people who were now going to invest in them. And I'd like to hear what George says about that afterwards, but I'd say the rating agencies share a good deal of culpability here and should be held civilly liable for this. Now, in addition to that, third factor is the leverage ratios. And I know I could picture my wife's reaction. The what, she'd say? I mean, leverage ratios. Leverage means debt. That's what I did my master's thesis on back 40 years ago. 40 years ago at Baruch College, was on what we called it then a debt ratio for utilities, telephone company, power companies. We had a debt ratio in the telephone company of 33%, which meant you had $1 of debt for $2 of equity. So it would be 1/2 to 1. The leverage ratio was 1/2 to 1. The power companies, I thought they were extravagant. They were at 2 to 1. They had 65% debt ratios, or roughly 65 to 35, roughly 2 to 1. These banks, which apparently were allowed to go as high as, I think it was roughly 9 to 1. I'm not positive of that, but, which blows my mind. That means a debt ratio of 90%. 90% of their assets funded by debt, 10% by equity. They were pushing it up to, I heard as high as 30 to 1. Now I've heard as high as 100 to 1. Wow. So they had debt ratios of 97 to 99%, which meant that in good times, oh my goodness, the profits are rolling in like anything. They invest a little bit at 4% and they're getting 6%, but they're doing it by a multiple of 30 to 1 or 100 to 1, so they're making a fortune with these debt ratios.
Wow.
But let me just finish, because there's one more, let me finish it, and I'd like to hear George's reaction. To me, these debt ratios were absolutely unwarranted, unjustified, and the culprits who were responsible for this, see, I'd like to go after them also. All these Wall Street people who were making, say, $250,000 or more for the past 10, 15 years, I think they are civilly liable to the extent they approved such leverage ratios to make this kind of money. So leverage ratios is another big part, because then when the problem starts, not only do you make a lot of money when times are good, but boy, when the times are bad, holy mackerel, that's when you have a total collapse. And the fourth part of the problem, so leverage is the third, and credit rating was the second. Fourth part was the lack of regulation, that the government allowed these banks, who were being backed up by the government, partly.
FDIC.
Right,
sure.
In some part, but in other parts, no. But still allowed such risk to be taken by people who then could leave their companies and, in effect, screw all the investors who are putting not millions and billions, but trillions of dollars of investment into this. And
It's mind-boggling.
It's mind-boggling that this was allowed to happen. Now I'd like to hear what George said.
A couple of points here. One, the reason why no one's going to be nailed civilly on this is for a simple reason. Everyone is guilty. The Clinton White House was guilty. The Congress was guilty. You're right. Barney Franks and all the boys were guilty. They were putting a lien on
Regulator.
Freddie Mae and Freddie Mac. That's another part of it, and the banks. And then you have the regulators, the FDIC, the OCC, control of currency, etc. They pretty much look the other way. So you have everyone guilty. That's why there's been no finger pointing. You notice the silence?
Yes.
Because there's so much blame
Okay.
to go
Chuck
around.
Schumer will be the first one to point the finger. but
Right.
He has nobody to point out. They all point at him. Everybody's guilty. It's a circle.
We're
okay?
not guilty, though.
Okay. Everybody is guilty within that world. The federal government, the Congress, the regulators, the rating agencies are guilty also. But they were rating things based on models. So if you accept it as part of the rules of your rating to AAA as a model, which now turns out to blow up in their face, so everybody is guilty.
It's complicated
so
because
if
there's so
everybody's
many.
guilty,
But how do you justify?
everyone's going to be, they're being rewarded for failure. I'm not justifying anything. I'm just pointing out what's going to happen.
But how does the rating agency get an excuse for knowing that these are loans made to people whose income you don't know, whose credit rating you don't know or is not good?
Because they're working on a formula and saying they're playing the percentages. I'm not saying what you're saying is unjustified. I'm suggesting since everybody's guilty, everybody will get a free
Everybody
pass.
in finance, not the ordinary person's not guilty.
No, Frank. No. Everyone within this world that created this mess is guilty, and they will all get off scot-free because they're too big
And
to
certainly,
fail.
no one's admitting that they
Yeah.
saw anything coming. George, let me ask you, the actions taken by Congress, do you think it's going to help the crisis? And what about the $700 billion bailout program? I mean, is that really going to be a solution?
I was, first of all, you have to look at the financial community as sort of a utility, as Charles Krauthammer points, and he's right. It's very different than looking at GM. If the whole financial system collapses, the nation collapses. So they had to do something here. However, what I couldn't understand and where I sort of disagree with the whole TOP program, banks who hold these toxic mortgages in their investment portfolios, under accounting rules, if they have to mark them to market. In other words, at some point in time, put a true value, not a formula model on a computer, a true value. And if they're illiquid and therefore cannot be marked to market, the accounting rules make you write them all down to zero. Well, they're not valueless. Yes, a lot of people will not pay off their mortgages and there will be losses, but it might be 20 cents on a dollar, 30% on a dollar, 40 cents on a dollar, not 100 cents on a dollar. I couldn't understand why they didn't suspend the FASB rules, which are the accounting rules that judge this, and say, all right, let's put a magic number, say 40 cents on a dollar, brings down your capital base, but it gives you liquidity, because this is all accounting games in this whole liquidity thing. Instead, the federal government comes in to say, well, we're going to buy these away from you at 40 cents on a dollar. Well, why should we as the taxpayers get in the hook? Why not just change the accounting rules? Now the $700 billion, the rules change every day of the week. Now they're not buying the toxic mortgages anymore. They're going to loan it to banks or buy stock in the banks to give them liquidity. It's been a liquidity crisis here. So I think what was happening, they were just pulling straws out of the air. They weren't sure. They knew they had to do something. Psychologically, they had to improve the market itself in terms of the financial market. So I'm not sure what the rules are today as opposed to what they were yesterday. I think at the end of the day, a taxpayer is going to get stuck with a lot of bills, and they're going to be printing money to fund all this, and sooner or later, the ugly head of inflation is going to stick its head out again, as it did in the late 70s back in the Carter years. So I'm not overwhelmed with this entire mess, and I think they don't know what they're doing. They may turn out and be lucky, but I'm not betting on the ranch on at this stage.
It sure is complicated for the average person to understand all the different aspects of this. Frank, let me ask you, what kind of help do you think should be provided by the government to homeowners facing foreclosure and lenders facing losses?
Well,
What's
It's a
appropriate?
good question, and I agree with George that the blame here is widespread, but and it involves also those who bought homes that they knew they couldn't or should have known they couldn't afford. The banks that loaned them to them, the mortgage brokers and so forth who were participating in this. But I also fault the two other, and this is when George says all, it's the government and Wall Street. There are so many people on Wall Street who I think have blame here, and I would like to see an examination as to whether or not there's not some civil liability case that could be made against people whose earnings were above 200, 250,000. I don't want to go after small players, but people who made decisions to improve their profits, knowing that they're taking this kind of unwarranted risk and that they could avoid the risk then.
Just
That
walk away.
They're deceptively passing it on to other people, other investors, and to the whole nation at large, and to the world, actually. So I'd like to go after these people, but the politicians, this is what gets me, and the Democrats, the people are, too many people in this past election thought that because Bush was in charge, he was responsible. The Republicans actually tried in 2005 to correct this and address this. But then this guilt trip was put on them, like I said before, by Schumer, Barney Frank, Senator Dodd, Maxine Walters, and mostly Democrats, this guilt trip that you're discriminating against minorities if you don't make these stupid loans to them when they can't afford it. They were putting those poor people at risk and the whole nation now at risk. And it's those Democrats who are culpable. Now what they should do, wherever there were deceptive loans, in my mind, the banks should take those laws completely. They should redo the loans, obviously, where a clear case of deception could be shown. I mean, you get all these papers to sign, poor people can be misled. There should be one simple page that states the basic criteria, the term of the mortgage, the interest rate, if it's adjustable, what the interest is for the first period, if there's a difference in interest rates. These things should be spelled out in big print in one page, not a 20-page document that is going to, stymie most people. That's not fair. And the law should make that very clear. The law goes to such lengths that it requires you to be given these huge documents that no one's going to have a chance to read. On the other hand, where people were stupid and foolish, I am not for bailing them out. I mean, I feel bad for them, but that if you start bailing them out, the people who are going to have to pay for that are the people who are not foolish and who are not stupid.
It would be endless.
That's right, and it's a huge. So I don't support bailing out people who were foolish or stupid on this. But the politicians, and it's a shame, that Chuck Schumer, still our senator here in New York, he's one of the culpable ones. All those people, Barney Frank, they're the ones to blame, and we need investigation. That's what the government ought to be doing. Conduct an investigation. Let's identify all
Frank,
the politicians.
I'll say it again. Everybody's guilty, so it's all being swept
I
under
don't
the
feel
rug.
guilty at all.
No, in terms of the powers
Connell's
that be.
not guilty.
The powers that
Patty's
be,
not guilty.
The powers that be are all guilty.
Ah.
And don't get me wrong. I don't disagree with your analysis. I'm saying the reality is, since everybody's guilty in power, it's going to be swept under the rug.
So we
It's
should
already
throw them
been
out of
swept.
office is what we should
Well,
do.
then we could throw them out of office. That's fine. But don't get me wrong. What the federal government is going to come up with, first of all, you got to remember, these loans were sold from the banks. The bank can't, if you default on your house tomorrow, the bank's not taking a loss on that, Frank, because they don't own your loan. They only service it. They get paid a 1% fee for servicing the loan. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, in effect, buy the mortgages, package them, and sell them off to others. They strip these down into derivative products, and nobody, the greater problem is, Frank, no one knows where all these pieces are, and they don't know how to put them back together again. It's Humpty Dumpty. They take a mortgage, break it up into 10 pieces, they can't put it back together. So what's going to happen is the Feds are going to turn around, say Freddie Mac, Fannie Mae, people are in trouble, come now. It's going to be the age, live in the age of rewarding for failure and victimhood. They're saying now you'll get a 4.5% loan for 30 years from the government, which I wish I had a 4.5% loan. I'd be happy with that, but I can't be rewarded for failure because I make my mortgage payments on a regular period. So they're going to reward for failure and give people 30-year loans. Now, the people that will be left out in the cold, the greatest hit in real estate in this nation was in California, Nevada, Florida, where you had a lot of speculators. They thought the single-family housing gig would go up. In parts of California, 40% of homes, single homes, family homes, were owned by speculators. Value goes down. They're not renting it. They can't meet the nut. They just walk away from it. They can't be rewarded. If it's a second home, you won't be able to be rewarded. Primary people who just didn't know, again, the government encouraged them to go for mortgages. The government encouraged the banks not to ask salary questions. So, again, everybody's guilty. Right. And the government, Barney Franks and company, the powers that be are going to run the government. They're not going to let these people lose their houses. So they're coming up with this idea now of 4.5% money for 30 to 40 years. And they'll be rewarded for failure. They'll be bailed out.
It seems like it's a very self-serving solution.
Yeah.
It's benefiting them, then they don't have to acknowledge anything.
That's correct.
I'm sorry.
I think we're at the halfway point.
Yeah, we're just a little bit past the halfway point. Are we doing a public? We are doing a public service announcement, so we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with our
Okay,
guests.
we're foregoing the public.
Oh, we're
service.
skipping that this
oh,
evening.
yeah,
Okay, I'm
okay.
very sorry.
Speaking
Go
of
ahead.
stupid and foolish, Frank, let's talk about the auto industry bailout.
Oh,
Okay.
okay.
What's your position on the government bailout? Should we, 10, 15, $25, $35 billion? Should we go down this road?
Changes every day, okay?
Changes every day. I think the latest news is that Nancy Pelosi has agreed to the President Bush's proposal not to add another $25 billion, but many people are unaware, $25 billion was already allocated to the auto industry to improve emission standards and so forth. And so we wanted to use that part of the $25 billion for this quote bailout, not to issue another $25 billion. Pelosi's now agreed to take $15 billion of that, so I think that's probably what's going to happen. Unless contracts can be renegotiated, and unless we can, do we have to go to an intermission? No.
we're not.
No, I don't
Okay.
think we're taking a break.
All right. Unless the what's his name, Gittlefinger, unless he agrees to renegotiating these contracts where UAW workers are being paid $70, $75 an hour. I know they've renegotiated some of this, whereas the other auto companies in the South, owned by foreign companies, Toyota and so forth, they're paid $45 an hour. So we have situations where these auto workers are, in effect, being
Sorry about that.
Auto workers were being paid not to work. They'd be not working and be paid like 90% of their salary. Ridiculous. So the costs were driven up, and that's hurt the auto. So unless this could all be renegotiated, I strongly lean against bailing out the auto companies. If these things can be renegotiated, not only for the auto workers union, but for management, and it should be, and what I think they should do is cut all salaries, the union, the management, cut them by a substantial amount, 30, 40%, and then, assuming that brings about a profitable status, have the management and the auto workers union benefit in the profits, share in the profits that are made then, so they can make up some of that cut in pay. But then it's contingent on success. Rather than having the taxpayers bail them out, have them make the sacrifice, them take the risk, take more reasonable pay, and if that brings them around to profitability, let them then share in the profits.
Okay, George, same question. Bailout for the auto industry or not?
In my judgment, there should be a prepackaged bankruptcy. Okay, the reason why the Congress is all up in arms against the bankruptcy for GM, as opposed to airlines that go into prepackaged bankruptcies, deals are cut, business goes on as usual, but it gives them protection, and the key to it is to renegotiate the contract.
The assets don't disappear.
Okay.
They're
Well,
still-
or lack of assets, but business goes on. Okay, bankruptcies mean they close the doors and, drop the blinds or whatever. The reason why the members of Congress are against a prepackaged bailout is because the unions are against it, because the unions know the courts will tell them, renegotiate your deals, and that's what happened. Don't get me wrong. Once again, guilt goes everywhere. Management is incompetent. The unions overreach. They had people getting paid for not working. That's why it was longshoremen years ago. Whalen, who was head of the longshoremen union back in the 40s, 50s, cut a deal where longshoremen got paid for not working. And the reason why why shipping dropped in the city of New York on the old piers and everything that's gone today is because you couldn't afford to pay this anymore, because you're paying people to do for nothing. Now, Toyota does it down south for $38 an hour. It's costing $78 an hour in Detroit. There is an imbalance here. But what happened is management for decades threw off costs to the future, an unfunded cost in terms of pension benefits, health benefits, all that. Now the day of reckoning has come with the baby boomer generation dying, and so they're dying as well. It's like Bethlehem Steel dying. 40,000 people worked at Bethlehem Steel in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania some years ago. Management was incompetent, the unions were incompetent, they couldn't compete, they went out of business. So we have to have a prepackaged bankruptcy. A bailout's not the answer because it's throwing good money after bad. They're only going to be back to the trough. I think they asked Ford, one of the guys on television the other day in the hearings, well, if we give you $9 billion, do you think you're going to be coming back to us? And he said, yeah, probably. Well, where do you cut the line on this? And if you rationalize this industry, what about every other industry that's hurting? So I don't know. The financial thing is different. That's a utility. And you cannot let the financial system collapse. Whether or not they did the right thing is an issue for us to debate from now to kingdom come, but they had to do something. GM, I don't think you just bail them out and say, here's a blank check to do what you want to do, because, where's the reward and punishment here? But once again, we're in the age of reward for failure. And they will probably be rewarded for failure.
It certainly looks that way. George, we just have a few minutes left, but Medicare and Social Security are also coming down the pike. They're looming on the horizon as more catastrophe. with unfunded obligations that amount to tens of trillions of dollars. Who will have to pay for this, and can they? What could be done about this? Is there any possible solution?
I hate to sound extraordinarily negative, but I will. The unfunded liability, as Frank was mentioning to me before we got started here, in Social Security and Medicaid is over $100 trillion so far.
Trillion with a T.
Trillion with a T. They will not fulfill those obligations. I'm sorry to say, when it comes to medical coverage, at some point in time, it's going to become like Canada and the way Europe is coming, that there will be suddenly decisions on whether or not, how sick you are you worthy of life anymore, and we will pull the plug. That's the only answer. They can never meet the obligations that are out there. You cannot raise taxes that high. There is nowhere to get the money. So over time, look to Canada model, what they do in the Netherlands, where they make a decision, shall we spend this kind of money on your health care? Well, you're 78 years old, you had a good life. And should we spend this money versus the 62-year-old guy is sick and, you know, still has a few years to go?
The quality of life decision.
Quality of life decisions will be made by the government.
What about privatization? Is there any hope for privatizing?
Not under the Obama regime, absolutely not. I mean, it's only going to get progressively worse. The tide is turning. We're out in the cold. And the Obama regime, they're not going to be quite like Hillary, but it's not going to be far off. So the government, within the next 48 years, probably going to be running the medical industry. And we know what happened in Canada, we know what's happening in Europe, and we'll be seeing the decline in medical services in this nation as well.
It seems negative, but it also seems to be the brutal reality. Frank, what do you think of that situation?
I know we have very little time. What we're doing is we're really being so unfair, our generation, my generation, to future generations, to your generation, to my grandchildren's generation and beyond. The $100 trillion is mind-boggling. We've got to do something, and specifically I would say for Social Security, for people above poverty income levels, we ought to reduce the increase that we get every year. We get a CPI increase, Consumer Price Index, 4%, we get 4% increases. I'd say reduce that just by 1% each year. Reduce it CPI minus 1%. We're going to have to raise the age, full age from 67 to 70. But by doing that, in 20 years, we've reduced it by 20%. That's what
I've never heard anybody suggest that before.
We've got to do something.
30 seconds.
That could make a big difference right there. We just have a few seconds left. Anything additional?
Well, basically, that would be the single biggest thing. Reducing the increase that we each get. I just started getting Social Security. Reduce it by 1%. We get a CPI increase minus 1%. In 30 years, that's 30% savings in the total Social Security outcome.
That's huge. We're going to have to leave it there. Gentlemen, thank you very much. We covered a lot of information on a very complicated topic tonight. Thank you to our viewers, and we hope you'll tune in again next week at the same time.
Over the years, humanity has made terrible mistakes. People were treated as less than human, even killed, because they were a different skin color, because they were a different faith, because they were unplanned, unknown, and helpless. But over time, we are slowly learning that we are all God's children, created in His image, and to disregard the value of human life, whether through hate or indifference, is wrong. That all human creation, regardless of race, religion, abilities, or stage of human life, has an inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, a right to love and be loved. As Americans, let's cherish the sanctity of life, because we know how it feels when others treat us as less than human.
If you were born after 1973, about 30% of your friends and relatives are missing. Since the Supreme Court approved legal abortions 30 years ago, nearly 1 of every 3 babies was aborted. That means 43 million U.S. children, teens, and young adults are missing. While we know how all of them disappeared, we will never know what they had to offer. Life. See what we've been missing.
When the pressures of the day are over and the last obligation has been met, there comes a time to celebrate the greatest gifts of all. To rediscover the joy of your children, call 1-800-A-FAMILY at Focus on the Family.
Tonight's topic is a look at the Obama administration on fiscal policy, social policy, and foreign policy, our second part, part 2. And our host is Patty Knapp.
Thank you for joining us. Tonight's guests are George Marlin and Frank Russo. George Marlin is a noted author who often writes for the New York Post, Newsday, and the New York Times. He has served as the CEO of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. He ran for mayor of New York City, and he's currently president of a financial group. Welcome, George. Frank Russo is a former division manager with AT&T and Verizon and serves on the executive committees of Long Islanders for Educational Reform and the Nassau Conservative Party. Frank is married with 7 children and 27 grandchildren. Welcome to you as well, Frank. And my co-host is Connell Friel. Connell?
Thank you, Patty. Frank, let me start with you. Education is an area of concern for President-elect Obama. Is he moving in the right direction?
Yeah, education, healthcare, and defense are the 3 major areas that state and federal governments spend money on. So education is one of the top 3 areas. In answer to the question, Obama's already made so many changes in his appointments. I mean, I'm actually not that displeased with some of his appointments that he's made. I thought they were going to be much worse. So I don't know to what extent what he's talked about is actually going to be acted upon. But what he said, and that's all I can base it on, what he said, I think he's moving in the wrong direction. And I think what's disappointing, he seems like a nice person, very pleasant personality, very genuine, but very hypocritical in the area of education, in my judgment. It's remarkably hypocritical. He's got 2 beautiful daughters, 10 and 7, I believe. He's going to be spending $56,000 a year to send his 2 daughters to the Sidwell Academy in Washington, D.C. $56,000 a year, $28,000 each. Now, where he's hypocritical, when the issue comes up for his fellow African Americans, and they're unhappy with Washington, D.C. schools, and the schools that many of them are in across the country, they're very, poll after poll has shown this, black parents, Hispanic parents, poor white parents are extraordinarily and deliriously happy with school choice. They can pick a private school. Typically, when we say private schools, just to be clear on this, of all the private schools which educate some 5 million children in our country, 10% are these ritzy private schools. 90% are religious private schools. Very simple, spending 1/3 to 1/2 what the public schools spend per pupil. They're not ritzy at all. They take the same kind of students, the same single-parent homes percentages, same demographics, poverty, income levels, and so forth. And yet, judging from the New York City Archdiocese schools, they're doing phenomenally better than the public schools. Higher graduation rates, better college attendance rates, and this phony arguments that you hear from some opponents of school choice, like, well, they don't take everybody. They do take everybody, or they kick out the trouble. They kick out a fraction, like 1/2 of 1%. Those are phony arguments that the teacher unions, the public school teacher unions, like to use. Obama's a hypocrite because he's opposing giving poor black parents and middle-income black parents and Hispanic parents and white parents the right to choose the school that they want for their child. Not only for better education, but some parents, believe it or not, there aren't that many, I grant you, like their kids to say a prayer at school. They like that. That should be up to them, and that shouldn't disqualify the student from getting the A to be taught math, history, English, and science. Barack Obama's a hypocrite. He said, well, I can afford it. I'm not going to send my 2 daughters to the Washington, D.C. public schools, but you other black folks, tough luck. You're going to have to send your kids to these miserable public schools in Washington, D.C. Now, Washington, D.C. also has a great superintendent down there now. I think her name is Dr. Rhee, R-H-E-E. And she's moving to make a lot of improvements. And she's very much, I think, for the opportunity scholarships that they're awarding some 2,000 to 3,000 low-income black families in Washington, D.C. But Barack Obama has kowtowed to the public school teacher unions, as have most Democrat candidates, in all honesty. They're hypocrites. They get the votes from low-income blacks and Hispanics, but they tell them that they're not going to have any luck in getting help from the government in picking a better school, even though the school would cost less than we're spending on the public school education. So everybody would win. Taxpayers would save money, the kids would get a better education, but the public school teacher unions don't like it because they want these private schools to close.
They want the status quo.
They want and when the private schools close, they get more jobs, more union jobs. Well, Barack Obama is kowtowing to the public school teacher unions, and he's putting the unions above the poor and middle-income black parents, Hispanic parents, and poor white parents. It's a disgrace, and I'm very disappointed in him.
George, you can comment on that if you wish, but I would like to ask you on the Obama administration, what do they face with Medicare and Medicaid and health care
Well,
coming down the road?
it is interesting, when Obama running for president in Democratic primaries had to run to the left of Hillary Clinton.
Anyone
Once
want to,
he knocked her off, he started moving further to the center to be in the center with John McCain. Now he has to face a lot of realities, financial realities as well, where right now the government printing press, financing, bailing out the banks, the financial system, possibly GM, and God knows what else becomes beyond that. He's going to be constrained in a certain way. They can only print so much money. He's proving to be a practical guy. Okay, he started as a community organizer in Chicago. Once he got elected to office, he became a practical pal and got into bed with the old Chicago machine. The Chicago machine and the community organizers were at war for the last 40 years. That goes back to when Saul Alinsky was still alive back in the 60s. My point is, he's a very pragmatic, practical guy. My concern is the community organizers that are going to take over the day-to-day running for the government. They've been waiting since the 60s to get their hands on the federal government. My fear is what's going to happen to the education department, the housing department, the health and welfare department, etc., where you're going to have these radical left-wingers taking over, trying to impose their will, bureaucratic will on America. That's my fear. Fiscal constraints, he might not be able to implement the radical ideas they have on health and Medicaid, Medicare. The trillions of dollars of unfunded liabilities, particularly in Medicare, there's going to have to be some restructuring at some point in time. Or they're going to start is just saying to people, cutting back on your benefits in the sense that if you're this ill, I'm sorry, we're going to pull the plug on you. But what we have to begin to realize is this goes from the federal government to the state and local government. In our state of New York State, county governments are going broke because they're stuck picking up a part of the tab of Medicaid. The state government is picking up a huge tab to the tune of north of $40 billion a year. In New York State, our benefits are so generous that the total cost of Medicaid in New York State is larger than the total combined spending of California and Texas, which is twice our population, and California is not exactly a very conservative state. So you have this whole treadmill here, and because Frank is right, the unions are calling all the shots here. The healthcare unions in New York dominate Albany with the education unions. We have empty hospitals all over the state, but we can't close them because the healthcare unions will lose jobs. So in effect, healthcare is being financed by government. The federal government picks up a piece of that tab. It's ballooning every year, and it's going to hit the wall sooner or later. New York State is in the hole over the next 4 years to the tune of $40 billion. If they don't restructure government, it's going to get progressively worse. So the tin cup is going to be out everywhere. And when the musical chair, when the music finally stops, who's not going to have a chair? State governments, local governments. I gave a speech up in Rochester not too long ago, Monroe County. The county executive told me 82% of our budget is dictated by unfunded state mandates, the bulk of which is Medicaid.
Wow.
So you have this whole cycle going on here, and with the money we're spending on all this other fiscal and financial crisis we're facing now, Obama's hands will be tied. But from a bureaucratic point of view, it could get a lot worse because of the radical left-wingers that'll take over the government. So it's a scary situation. I don't know what's going to happen. All I can say is it's probably going to get worse before it gets better. And in the end, the average person will suffer because health care over time has to suffer.
It's pretty nightmarish.
It just can't go on forever. It's a nightmare issue.
George, let's move to energy, Obama's energy policy. Where do you think we're going with nuclear, with drilling?
Well, again, here's another one. He went far to the left during the campaign. Let's face it, the whole green message is wonderful and sounds nice and everything's great. But in the meantime, the American people have certain demands for energy. They're not going to change their minds. You can't avoid nuclear. You can't avoid drilling. They will try to put the battle off. But again, oil now is back down to $46 a barrel. The crisis mentally is over. People are going to put gas in their car and continue driving. They will lose interest in these issues. So when it was up at $150, $180 a barrel, everybody was talking about it. You notice the silence on this subject in recent weeks since the oil has begun to drop. They will once again try to impose a left-wing agenda. They will try to approve a radical environmental green agenda, which is ideologically driven, not scientifically driven. It will, in the end of the day, increase the costs for everybody involved and will probably not save a heck of a lot or change a heck of a lot, just add layers and more layers of community organizing bureaucracy that is going to not improve the energy situation, but just sort of bear down on it by laying layers of bureaucracy and just drive people crazy. So I don't have great hope for great
Apparently
improvement
not.
during this time. They'll just drive a lot of people crazy, okay? It's the nature of the beast.
Frank, did you want to comment on that? And then I also wanted to ask you about some of the social issues.
Yeah, briefly, and here I may have more of a liberal position on this. Yeah. I was opposed to what I'm going to tell you some years ago, but my thinking lately, because I'm so concerned about the craziness in the Middle East and how much of our oil comes from the Middle East, and the precarious situation our nation would be put in should they ever decide to put certain embargoes and whatnot. I just am so concerned about it. What I am now in favor of, and I'd be interested in George's brief comment on it, and I was not for this 10 years ago, 5 years ago even, I hate the word tax, but I do favor a large tax on gasoline. And let me give you the whole idea of maybe $1 to $2 per gallon, believe it or not. It would be astronomical. It would raise tens of billions of dollars. But I don't want the government to, in effect, get more tax money. What I then also want the government to do is to return the money in the form of income tax reductions, but focused on lower and middle income people. So I'd want to greatly reduce the income taxes, that 10 and 15% brackets, and make them, maybe a 5%, 10 and 15, and expand the brackets. I want to return, I'd say 80% of the money. 20% maybe should go towards debt reduction. But the objective would be, when I saw how many people were focused on now, suddenly, instead of getting these huge, big cars, when the gas was $4 a gallon, they were saying, oh my goodness, next car I've got to get has got to be much more economical. I want to get 30 miles to the gallon if I can. People were thinking that way. It's obvious. That's what prices and the market says. So by raising the price $1 to $2 per gallon, which is a lot, I know, going to raise tens of billion, maybe at $100 billion or more dollars. I think that would motivate through private choices people into picking more efficient cars, would encourage the automotive industry to make and manufacture more efficient cars so that we become somewhat less dependent on this very questionable part of the world, the Middle East, where we get so much of our oil, and even South America, Venezuela and Chavez and so forth. The sources of oil are very problematic to me. But again, I don't want to maybe keep 20% of these extra tax revenues towards address the deficits that's growing in leaps and bounds. But 80% of it, I'd want to give back to middle and lower income people in the form of lower income taxes, or maybe even tax credits, something, return the money to them so that they're not being hurt by this. Now on the social issues?
Yes, under Obama, abortion.
Wait.
Yeah,
Okay.
I was
Do you want to jump in?
Please let George comment on
I think
that.
Frank has a fever on it. Okay.
Thanks, George.
First of all, to throw a $2 tax and in effect have income redistribution to me is absurd. But more important, I'm not going to penalize the person who has to drive to work. Okay? It's as simple as that. When I was running the Port Authority in New York, New Jersey, I rejected consistently pricing changing depending on rush hours and everything else. Now they do that now. Didn't do it under my time, and I give the very simple answer. I'm not going to penalize a stiff who has to drive to work. Okay? It's as simple as that. And to say we're going to take this tax, first of all, to redistribute it back to the same people who are basically paying it, to me is ridiculous. Again, I share his concern about oil from overseas, particularly if there's embargoes and madness we have a new round of madness going around the world. But at the same time, Europe is nuclear. We are not. Nuclear is clean and cheap, but we have the environmental nuts who are fighting it for years. Part of our problem is here we don't have enough refineries. Oil is not often the issue. It's the fact that we can't refine it because the environmental nuts have not let us build a new refinery in this country for 20 years. In addition, we could do a lot of digging up in Alaska and not ruin much of Alaska. Governor Palin, the governor of Alaska, is all for it. I'll rely on her good judgment. She got elected governor. They seem to want it up there.
Drill, baby, drill.
You know, to me, the answer is always so often, let's tax and redistribute money. That always fails. We're seeing it fail in the state of New York with the STAR education program we have, a redistributing of income. To me, redistribution is not the answer. It causes people to work less, work harder, not work as hard, and just say, why do I need this? Okay, so no, I'm sorry, I don't think Frank's answer is yet the correct one. Let's look to nuclear, let's look to digging in this country and becoming dependent on ourselves without taxing people to death on the issue. But anyway, Frank,
I've got to respond. Yeah, I want another quick response to that. I'm for drilling in Alaska. I'm for the offshore drilling, so I differ with Obama on some of that. But there's a limited amount of oil. There is clearly, the statistics are overwhelming on this. There's a limited amount. We are importing 60% of our oil consumption from overseas. 60%. Even if we start drilling, it'll never go below 50%. Unless, I don't want income redistribution. That's not the objective. My objective is to incent people to be more efficient in the kind of cars they're driving, to carpool a little bit more. To the extent it's cheap, you're wasting it. You're giving an incentive to waste something that is very limited and for which we're dependent on sources that are very unreliable and questionable and kooky in many ways. So it's not, the objective is not income redistribution, it's to reduce energy consumption. It's not the energy, the electricity and so forth, that's from coal primarily. It's gasoline in the cars. That is where most of our oil's going, and that's what we've got to address, I think.
It is. It's an overwhelming issue. Okay, so we started to get into Obama's take on social issues and what direction he's going in. What is your feeling about where he's headed with abortion, gay marriage?
Oh, abortion and gay marriage. On abortion, very disappointed in Obama. Again, he comes through as such a nice guy, fun-loving guy, and yet I think his views are extreme. Again, maybe he took these positions to be more left-wing than Hillary Clinton, as George said. That very well could be the case. But people don't want to consider what abortion really is. That's the problem. I know of too many people. I talk to too many people. We know people who've had abortions. And it has a tremendous impact. Anyone who thinks about what it really involves, it does impact them, that post-abortion syndrome. Abortion is taking innocent human life. There's no question about it. This is not a theological point. I happen to be Catholic. That's irrelevant. Theologians differ on when human life begins. Philosophers differ. But the one group and lawyers differ. They differed on whether black people were persons. Right. The lawyers said black people were not lawyers back 150 years ago.
Not people.
Property.
Right, and lawyers, they were property. And lawyers are taking that position today in many cases. But scientists, there's no disagreement. Everyone knows that each one of us here and everyone at home had one point of beginning for their life. It was the moment of conception, when the embryo was joined with the sperm. When you had fertilization, that's when that human life came into existence. And what the pro-abortion people in Obama, they don't want to look at sonograms which show pictures of babies at 7 weeks, 8 weeks, 10 weeks. You can see that baby's face on a sonogram. And we've shown that in some of our videos. They don't want to deal with this reality, just like probably the Nazis didn't want the German people to see what their camps looked like when they were putting to death 12 million people.
They didn't want to humanize them.
They didn't want to humanize it. And to the extent people don't see it, can't visualize it, they feel bad, but what the heck. Once you see what you're destroying, that makes a difference. And Obama is as strongly pro-abortion as anyone. He's defending the right to kill babies up through all 9 months of pregnancy. He's saying, based on his votes in Illinois and his statements while he was running for president, to get the extreme pro-abortion support, you could deliver a baby 80% feet first, turn the baby around the mother's uterus, deliver the feet first, bring out the torso, and doctor, you can take that knife and stab it in the baby's neck and kill it. Obama is saying it's okay to do that. Partial birth abortion, thousands of them are done every year. Obama is an extremist on that. I'm hoping because of the fiscal crisis, this might be one of the tangential and unexpected benefits of the fiscal crisis, that because of that, he may not want to antagonize so many of his supporters who value human life and who don't want to destroy human life and who have a different view from him and his support of Planned Parenthood and the extremists who favor it. On gay marriage, He said he's opposed to gay marriage, but he's for civil unions, he's for giving them all the benefits. Well, giving them all the benefits is what it's about. If we start giving homosexuals the rights that are today assigned to
Reserved.
married couples, what we're doing, we give them tax benefits, health benefits. It's because of the contribution that the married couple makes to the procreation, education of children, and the continuation of the human race. Homosexuals cannot procreate. They can procreate in a heterosexual way, but not in a homosexual way. The economic consequences are disastrous. And to be honest, what I see happening even more than the homosexuals benefiting is other bizarre things. For instance, I could see two elderly men, my age, in their 60s or 70s. You know, their wives are dead, or two women, two elderly women in their 70s, their husbands are dead, and they like each other. They're not having sex. It's not a sexual thing. But they're going to say, hey, if we, quote, get married, which we'd be allowed to do under the gay marriage thing, any two people get married, whether it's man and woman or two men. You then will qualify for certain Social Security benefits, pension benefits, health benefits. That will worsen the already dangerous situation we've talked about in Social Security.
That's a very good point.
Yes, and corporations with the pension costs and health costs. So the economic consequences would be disaster. The physiological aspects of homosexual behavior are harmful to homosexuals. It's very dangerous behavior.
They have a greatly reduced lifespan.
A greatly reduced lifespan, a high AIDS rate. So there's a physiological argument. There's a civil rights argument. If you make gay marriage legal, you're going to see what happened in Boston, Massachusetts occur more and more often. The civil rights of Christians and Jews and Muslims are going to be denied. In Boston, the Catholic Church, Catholic Charities had adoption services. They said, we cannot allow adoption by homosexuals. It's contrary to our beliefs. We want a mother and a father at home, not two men or two women. They had to close their adoption services because they were charged with discrimination against homosexuals. And of course,
such a shame.
Another issue, no one wants to talk about it, the data is very strong, very overwhelming. Homosexuals are more prone to abuse children by 10 to 20 times. They'll come back and say 2/3 of all abuse, child abuse, is committed by heterosexuals, and that's true. 1/3 of the child abuse is committed by homosexuals. But the fact that 30 to 35% of all child abuse is committed by 2 to 3% of the population that's homosexual, you work out the numbers.
Way out of proportion.
Homosexuals are 14 to 20 times as likely to abuse children, which is why Catholic Charities doesn't want to, one of the reasons they don't want to allow adoption by homosexuals. So Obama is wrong on his view of civil unions, gay marriage, and abortion. And it's
Overwhelmingly
disappointing.
so.
Well, I think that's going to be the most frightening part of the Obama administration, okay, because there's a lot of executive things he could do. Here's a couple of things. One, the executive ban on funding abortions in U.S. overseas health agencies will be eliminated. That's day one, executive order. Next executive order, barring federal financing of embryo stem cell research, will be eliminated. He has made it perfectly clear that he will sign the Freedom of Choice Act. That's the first thing he's going to do. Now, that's going to add a lot of problems to Christian, Catholic, Jewish, religious hospitals. I would hope the Archbishop of New York, if this comes about, says to the government, here's the keys, the hospitals are yours. Okay. Take the Catholic names off, get out of the business. Get out of the adoption business. Get out of the whole business. Okay. We probably shouldn't have been there in the first place. Catholic Charities, sadly to say, in many dioceses and archdioceses in the United States, is neither Catholic nor charitable. It's an adjunct to the federal government. Close it down. So Catholic religious leaders are going to have to make some serious decisions when we see the implications of the policies coming out of the Obama administration. Also, we have a Congress now which will probably get a national gay rights bill. Teddy Kennedy's been pushing it for years. We'll probably get a national hate crimes bill. So the agendas we've seen in states like New York, we're going to see them on a national level. It's very scary what could happen in the next 2 years.
Sounds radically different.
Frank, where are we on affirmative action? We started moving on in 1972. Where do we stand now? Where's Obama going to take us? President?
Well, I have a concern there, and let me draw a distinction. Many people are not familiar with the distinction between affirmative action and something called affirmative action override or race preferences. I support affirmative action. Affirmative action started in '72, and what that meant was that corporations, government, was required to make extra attempts to locate and hire and promote qualified members of minority groups and eliminate past discrimination, eliminate the connections, the white connections argument that I think is legitimate, where people just promote their friends and their neighbors and relatives to positions, and That's unfair then to minority groups. But what also happened, and I saw it at AT&T, I saw it at New York Telephone and Verizon, was something called the affirmative action override. Policy in writing. Nobody's even aware of it, and I bet you no one's ever even seen one of these. I had a document in writing from AT&T. Affirmative action override said that you are required, as a division manager in AT&T or a telephone company, you're required to hire or promote members of underutilized groups who are basically qualified in preference to members of